video is going to be on how to trim a basic cylinder shape. One of the first things that I do when I'm getting started to trim a form is to assess where the weight is in the form. For most beginners, the weight will be around in this area, sometimes a little bit at the base, but most of the time it'll be right about here. What I can do, depending on the width of the cylinder that I have, I can put my hand all the way in the bottom. I could use a needle tool and I can poke through and feel where the needle tool just hits my finger on the interior and lift out. And that's telling me about how much clay I have at that bottom, because I'm going to need to trim a foot to this. So I want to make sure that I don't trim too deep. I can also do this on the side of the form if I wanted to. So I can insert my needle tool, feel where it hits my finger, just where it just hits, and remove. And that's telling me that I have that much clay there. So I definitely have more clay here. I want to make sure that I kind of fill in or smooth over those holes. So I know where I need to trim. That's one of the first things, is understanding where you need to trim the form and where you don't. So I'm going to use the concentric circles on the wheel head to recenter this piece upside down. And I'm going to line it up on center as best as I can just through eye. I'm going to use my needle tool now. I'm going to start my wheel. Now notice that I'm anchored down here, and I'm just going to let my needle tool hit the form. All right, so needle tool made a mark here. I'm going to turn that line so it's directly in front of me. And what it's telling me is that the form right now is too close to me on this side. So I'm going to push the form away from me just a little, hold the form, erase the line, and I'm going to do this again. Ideally, I want the form to hit the needle tool at least 75 to 80%. Now, the better you get at throwing cylinders, the more centered they are, the more straight they are, the easier it is going to be to put this form back on the wheel and center it. For the initial first cylinders that you've made, this can be difficult. So that's why I encourage you to throw a lot of cylinders so you have a lot to work with. I'm going to need some soft clay, because I'm going to need to make sure this is stuck down to the wheel. I'm going to roll a small coil, hold the piece, and I'm going to use these little tabs to hold the piece down. So I'm going to push down, and then I'm going to push in. And I'm going to do this at 3 different points. Pushing half of it down, half of it in. I'm encouraging you to do this because I'm wanting students to avoid pushing just directly inward, because a lot of times they'll dent the rim of the form. And when the form is leather hard like this, you cannot fix that. It will usually destroy, it'll crack the rim, so you want to avoid that. The first tool that I'm going to use is I'm going to use my large trimming tool. When I hold my trimming tools, I don't hold them all the way down at the base. I'm going to hold them all the way towards the top. I actually put 2 fingers on either side because I have a lot of control with it that way. When I'm trimming as well, my elbows are down on my legs, and I usually put one hand on top. And again, I'm going to meet my hands as much as I can, just as when I'm pulling a form, so I have more stability. My first goal is to trim down the excess on the sides. So the rule of thumb in trimming is that your wheel moves fast. Now, it doesn't have to be hyper speed fast, but fast, definitely not this slow. So wheel speed fast, tool moves slow. Okay. So just as I pull at 4 o'clock, I trim at 4 o'clock. So I'm trimming down that excess. I established that most of my thickness was right about here, so I'm focusing on that area. So I'm going to keep trimming that exterior. I'm putting downward pressure, not a ton. I don't want to break the interior of this form, but I am putting downward pressure. That's going to help avoid me pushing so much from here without any pressure here and pushing the form off of the wheel. If that does happen, it's not the end of the world. I mean, sometimes it does wreck the piece, but if it doesn't, put the piece back on, recenter it, and move on. All right. Once I feel like I've trimmed most of that excess weight there, I am going to want to refine the top of the form. So I'm going to hold my tool flat now and just make sure that it's nice and flat. Now I'm going to switch to the smaller trimming tool in your kit. And I'm going to use you have two sides of it. It has a flat side and then it has a round side. I'm going to use the flat side. And I'm going to establish where my foot is going to be. So I usually like the foot ring to be at least 1/2 of an inch. I don't want it so tiny. So I'm going to hold steady and start putting pressure down. So I'm starting to establish where the foot's going to be and where I'm going to start trimming out. Now remember, I did that needle tool check in the center, and I don't have a ton of clay here, but I am going to have enough to remove, so I'm just going to do that slowly. So again, my wheel speed is fast and my tool moves slow. So I'm going to hold my tool, remove clay from the interior, I also like to make this little edge here. Right now it's like this. I want it to be a little bit more straight. So I'm going to hold this tool in upright, and I'm going to trim that so it's just a little bit more straight. Making sure I'm getting all those trimming lines out. By moving your tool slower, you will not have a lot of trimming lines. The next thing I like to do in my forms is I like to give this base a nice little lift here. There's a lot of reasons why I do that, and I'll explain this in class, but a lot of it has to do with glazing. So I'm going to take, again, this same straight edge here, but when I'm using this, I'm going to go down probably about 1/4 of an inch only, and I'm going to put it in at an angle. So I want this to be a 45-degree angle. Trimming that angle in. Now I'm going to take this tool and put it right back where I made that groove, and I'm going to trim away that excess of clay that happened. So this is giving this a nice little lift. What's really important is that right now this edge is pretty sharp. I don't want that. If it feels sharp now, it's going to feel really sharp once it has been bisque fired. So I'm going to round a lot of this off, just slightly, just so it's softer. I can simply use pressure from my fingers to do this. If I felt like I needed to, I could use a little bit of dampness from a sponge to just give that surface a little bit more smoothness. And I can finish off with just really taking any more excess off that I feel that's there. I'm going to take my tabs off. And now my form is complete. It's trimmed, has a nice foot to it, has a nice base trimmed. What's really important is that all of you get into the habit of signing your pieces. I encourage you to sign your name in here or initials. I encourage you to use a ballpoint pen, not a needle tool, as a needle tool will not sign very well. And then I usually will just take a sponge and get any excess off. I will take the time as well to really sponge and refine the rim, make sure it's nice and soft. This again is going to help me not have to try and do this refinement after the form has been bisque fired, which is much more difficult, and you will have to use sandpaper. So I'm gonna get any kind of stuff off now that I need to. And I'm gonna do that one more time. So I have this cylinder. This one is too narrow for me to put my hand in and do a needle tool check. So I really am looking at it. I'm looking at, I feel like how much is there at the base. How does the weight feel? I'm gonna line this up by eye as good as I can, and I'm gonna get my needle tool. So as I start, it's marking the piece. Again, where that mark is, I'm gonna turn it right in front of me. And I'm gonna push the form away from me just a little, hold the piece, erase the line, and do that again. Remember, I'm looking for it to hit at least 75, 80%. As long as this clay doesn't get too stiff, I can reuse it. And again, I'm going to start with my larger tool, allowing it to take off that excess clay. You'll start noticing as I trim and I do demonstrations on this video, or I do demonstrations in class, when I start trimming, my wheel speed usually isn't really fast. I get into the position where I feel comfortable and then I'm trimming well, and then I speed up once I'm in a position that I feel is good. And I'm steady. Now I'm going to shift to the smaller tool. Actually, I'm going to make sure this is nice and flat. From when I wire cut it, I had a little bit of a bump in the top, so I'm just going to clear that away. Now again, I'm going to shift to this flat side. And I can trim this excess away. Make sure this has a nice right angle. And now I'm going to use this tool here, 45-degree angle. And I'm going to position it now the opposite way. And I'm going to take the time to really refine this form, taking those trimming lines out, softening edges, making things a little bit more rounded. I as well asked you guys to get a small selection of these small trimming tools. For some of you, this is going to come really handy. Some of you might like using these smaller trimming tools in, let's say, doing this area here. You might feel more control. The other thing that's nice about these trimming tools is the ability to kind of trim some lines into your form if you chose to. So trimming tools can also be used to create decorative approaches. So I can simply put in some banding lines. And that can create some visual interest in the form. Softening things, smoothing things. Removing the tabs, smoothing that rim. And again, making sure that I sign the form.